Picture this. Thousands of warriors charging across scorching desert sand, their war cries echoing through the heat-warped air, while British soldiers scramble to form defensive positions, knowing they're outnumbered more than 2-1. This isn't a Hollywood film, this is real history. And what happened on those blood-soaked plains in March 1884 would shake the British Empire to its core. The question is, would you have survived? Let me take you back to a time when empires clashed in the most unforgiving landscape on Earth, where the temperature could kill you just as easily as a spear, and where one charismatic leader managed to unite scattered desert tribes into a force that terrified one of the most powerful military machines in the world. Now, to understand why British soldiers found themselves fighting for their lives in the middle of Sudan, we need to rewind a few years. The story doesn't start with battles and bloodshed. It starts with something far more dangerous. Religious fervor and political uprising. In 1881, whilst the British were busy expanding their empire across Africa, a remarkable figure emerged from the dusty villages of Sudan. His name was Muhammad Ahmad, and he had a message that would electrify the region. He declared himself the Mahdi, the prophesied redeemer of Islam chosen by divine will to cleanse the faith and drive out corrupt foreign rulers. Bold claim, right? But here's the thing. People believed him, and not just a handful of followers. We're talking thousands upon thousands of devoted warriors willing to die for his cause. At this point, Sudan was under Egyptian control, but everyone knew who was really pulling the strings to British. Egypt might have been the face of authority, but British interests, British money, and British influence ran deep through every level of governance. The Mahdi saw this clearly, and he wasn't having any of it. His message was simple, yet powerful. Return to pure Islamic principles, reject foreign domination, and establish an Islamic state free from outside interference. The British, naturally, were not amused. This wasn't just some minor rebellion they could ignore. This was a direct threat to their strategic interests in the region, particularly around the Red Sea, which was absolutely vital for trade routes to India and the Far East. Control the Red Sea, control the empire's lifeline. Lose the Red Sea, and you've got a massive problem. So it started as a religious movement, quickly transformed into full-scale warfare. The Mahdi's followers, known as the Mahdists, began scoring victory after victory against Egyptian forces. And I'm not talking about minor skirmishes. I'm talking about crushing, devastating defeats that sent shockwaves through Cairo and London alike. The worst of these came in 1883 at a place called El Obeid. An Egyptian army under Colonel William Hicks, a British officer, by the way, marched into the interior with about 10,000 men. They were supposed to put down the rebellion once and for all. Instead, they were annihilated. Almost the entire force was wiped out. Hicks himself was killed, along with most of his officers. It was a disaster of epic proportions, and it sent a very clear message. The Mahdists were not to be underestimated. The British government was now in a proper bind. They couldn't just let these defeats stand unchallenged. Their reputation was on the line. Their strategic interests were threatened. And every day, the Mahdi grew stronger. Something had to be done, and it had to be done quickly. And to Major General Sir Gerald Graham, a seasoned military commander tasked with an unenviable mission: take a force into hostile territory, find the Mahdist army, and crush it decisively. Simple on paper, right? But Graham knew this wouldn't be like fighting in the green fields of Europe. This was Sudan, a place where the sun could literally cook you alive, where water was scarce, and where the enemy knew every rock, every dune, every hiding place. Graham assembled a force of roughly 4,500 well-trained British soldiers. These weren't raw recruits, these were professional troops, disciplined and experienced. They had modern rifles, artillery pieces, and all the advantages of Victorian military technology. But standing between them and victory was Osman Digna, a fierce and cunning commander utterly devoted to the Mahdi's cause. Intelligence reports were sketchy at best, but Graham's officers estimated Digna commanded somewhere around 10,000 warriors. Now, these weren't soldiers in the traditional sense. Most were tribesmen, armed with swords, spears, and whatever old rifles they could scavenge. But what they lacked in equipment, they more than made up for in motivation, courage, and intimate knowledge of the terrain. These men believed they were fighting a holy war, and that kind of conviction makes for a terrifying enemy. The British force set off from Suakin, a port town on the Red Sea coast, and began their march inland toward Tamai. The heat was oppressive, the terrain treacherous, and every step took them deeper into enemy territory. The soldiers knew they were walking into a trap of sorts. Dignus forces were out there somewhere, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. On the night of March 12, 1884, Graham ordered his troops to establish a defensive camp. They weren't far from Dignus' known positions, and everyone sensed that battle was imminent. The soldiers tried to rest, but rest would prove impossible. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, the silence was shattered. Mahdist riflemen, moving under cover of darkness, approached the British camp and opened fire. Now, you've got to understand, these weren't crack shots we're talking about. The shooting was wild, imprecise, more designed to harass and unsettle than to inflict serious casualties. But imagine you're a British soldier, trying to sleep in hostile territory, and suddenly bullets are whizzing overhead. Your adrenaline's pumping, your heart's racing, and you know that come dawn, all hell is going to break loose. The sporadic firing continued through the night, giving no one any real rest. The Mahdists were playing a psychological game, wearing down the British before the real fight even began. Clever. Really. When dawn finally broke, Graham had had enough of this harassment. He ordered his artillery crews to bring their guns to bear on the Mahdist skirmishers who'd been causing trouble all night. B guns. Roreto Live sent in shells screaming across the desert. The skirmishers scattered, driven back by the explosive firepower. But Graham knew this was just the opening act. The real Mahdist army was out there, just beyond the horizon, and they'd be coming soon. Graham ordered his troops into the famous British infantry square for Machina, defensive arrangement where soldiers formed a hollow square, facing outward in all directions. This formation had proven devastatingly effective against mass charges, allowing troops to fire in any direction whilst protecting against being flanked or surrounded. If you wanted to break a square, you'd have to get close enough to engage in brutal hand-to-hand combat, and that meant running through a wall of rifle fire. As the British formed their squares, they could see the Mahdist forces assembling in the distance. Thousands of warriors, their white robes visible against the brown desert landscape, preparing for the charge. The tension must have been unbearable. Graham sent his squadrons of British cavalry forward on the left flank to probe the enemy positions. The horsemen advanced, then dismounted and began engaging the Mahdists with rifle fire. It seemed to be working at first, but the sheer numbers of Mahdist warriors began to tell. The cavalry troopers found themselves in danger of being overrun, and they had no choice but to fall back to the safety of the squares. And then, the charge began. Thousands of Mahdist warriors surged forward, screaming their battle cries, weapons raised, rushing headlong toward the British lines. The distance closed rapidly. 500 yards, 400, 300, and then the British opened fire. The noise must have been absolutely deafening. Hundreds of rifles firing in unison, the crack of gunfire echoing across the desert, spent cartridges clattering to the ground as soldiers worked their bolts frantically, loading and firing as fast as humanly possible. The Mahdists fell in droves, but they kept coming. Wave after wave of warriors charged the squares, seemingly heedless of the casualties. The heat was oppressive, the sun beating down mercilessly, and thick clouds of gun smoke mixed with dust kicked up by thousands of feet, reducing visibility to almost nothing. The Black Watch Regiment, positioned at the front of one square, suddenly found themselves in serious trouble. The relentless, Mahdist charges, combined with the smoke and dust, making it impossible to see clearly. Through the regiment, into confusion. Soldiers were firing blind, unsure where the enemy was coming from. And in that moment of chaos, disaster struck. The Mahdists broke through. Warriors flooded into the square, and suddenly it was no longer a firefight. It was hand-to-hand combat of the most brutal kind imaginable. Bayonets against swords, rifle butts against spears, men grappling in the dust, fighting desperately for their lives. The brigade was forced to fall back under intense pressure, and in the chaos, 3 Royal Navy artillery pieces had to be abandoned. British casualties were mounting rapidly. Officers were shouting orders, trying to restore control, while soldiers fought savagely just to stay alive. But here's where British military discipline showed its worth. A neighboring British square, seeing the danger, redirected their fire to support their beleaguered comrades. Concentrated volleys slammed into the Mahdist warriors who'd broken through, and the coordinated firepower began to turn the tide. The Mahdists were driven back, and the British seized the opportunity. They advanced, fighting their way forward, and successfully recaptured the abandoned artillery pieces. Those guns were more than just weapons. They were symbols of British military pride, and losing them would have been a humiliating defeat. Just when it seemed the situation was stabilizing, another group of Mahdist warriors launched a surprise attack from a hidden gully nearby. They'd concealed themselves brilliantly, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But the British had learned their lesson. This time they were ready, and the attackers were cut down by devastating volleys before they could reach the squares. The Mahdist forces, having suffered catastrophic casualties and facing the full weight of British firepower, finally began to retreat. Osman Digna's camp was overrun, and gradually the battlefield fell silent except for the groans of the wounded and dying. The butcher's bill was staggering. The British had suffered 214 casualties, killed or wounded, including 10 officers. For context, this was the highest casualty rate the British would suffer in any single battle during the entire Mahdist War. The professional, well-equipped British army had been pushed to the absolute brink. But the Mahdists had paid an even higher price. Estimates suggest they lost as many as 4,000 men on that blood-soaked field. 4,000 warriors who charged into the teeth of modern rifles and artillery, believing their cause was righteous and their sacrifice meaningful. Now, you'd think that after such a devastating defeat, Osman Digna's influence would be broken, right? That his prestige among the tribes would be shattered, and British authority would be firmly re-established. Well, here's where the story takes an interesting turn. Despite the tactical victory, the British had failed to achieve their strategic objective. They hadn't destroyed Digna's power base or captured the man himself. And when General Graham's expeditionary force withdrew later that year, as they inevitably had to, because maintaining such forces in hostile desert territory was logistically impossible, all those hard-won gains simply evaporated. Osman Digna slowly reasserted his influence over the region. The tribes who'd fought alongside him saw that the British hadn't stayed, that they'd come, fought, and left. The Mahdist cause remained alive, and the struggle for Sudan would continue for years to come. So what's the lesson here? Sometimes victory on the battlefield doesn't translate to victory in the broader war. The British had won the fight at Tamai, but they hadn't won the peace. They'd demonstrated their military might, but they hadn't broken the will of the Sudanese people or the power of the Mahdist movement. This battle was just one chapter in a much longer story, a story of empire and resistance, of modern military technology versus traditional warfare, of foreign intervention in regional conflicts. Sound familiar? It should, because these same themes echo through history right up to the present day. The desert sands of Tamai witnessed something profound that day in March 1884. witnessed the collision of two very different worlds. The desperate courage of warriors fighting for their homeland and their faith, and the disciplined determination of professional soldiers far from home fighting for interests they might not have fully understood. And here's the thing that really gets me. Every single person on that battlefield, British or Mahdist, was absolutely convinced they were fighting for the right reasons. Both sides believed their cause was just, their actions necessary. That's the tragedy of war, isn't it? It's rarely as simple as good versus evil. It's usually just different perspectives, different interests, colliding violently. If you've found this deep dive into forgotten history fascinating, do me a solid and hit that like button. It genuinely helps more people discover these incredible stories. And if you want more tales of battles that shaped the world, subscribe and ring that notification bell so you'd never miss an upload. Trust me, we've got some absolute crackers coming up. What do you think? Could you have held that square against thousands of charging warriors? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. Until next time, remember, history isn't just dates and names. It's real people, real fear, real courage, and real consequences that echo through the centuries. Cheers.